right, here we go with our Q&A session regarding training and education. Joining us is John Todaro from Eagle Emergency Consultants in Central Florida, and Tom Bouthillet in Hilton Head Island Fire Rescue in South Carolina, and Brett Lyle from Brett Lyle Coaching. Glad to have all of you here. We've heard a great presentation from John on the state of technology and resuscitation, some good information on the panel. So this is everyone's opportunity to ask us some questions, make your comments, and we'll just kind of continue the conversation here. Even though this isn't a panel discussion, oftentimes it ends up being a little bit of an extension of that, and that's fine. But please jump into the conversation if you would, typing in your items of interest in the Q&A tab up in the corner. If you're ready to kind of step out, use that raise your hand icon and turn on your webcam and microphone and come up on the digital stage with us here and ask your question. That's a cool thing to do. And we'll just see where this all goes. So to kind of kick things off, Tom, if you kind of had the magic wand, we've done this in some of the other sessions, what sort of technology would you like to see become available in the area of training, particularly in resuscitation?
I actually kind of like I kind of like the equipment we have, to be honest with you. Maybe if it was easier to display. I still think when we're training, what I do is I run over to the podium, I go to Google, I type in metronome, I set it to 110, I put it up on the screen, and then I also in the screen next to it run a clock so that everyone, not just the people that are participating on their hands and knees doing the resuscitation, but everyone else in the room, whether they're waiting their turn or just observing, it improves everyone's situational awareness so that they can see when they're coming up to 1 minute and 45 seconds in the cycle. And everyone knows that's when they start to pre-charge the defibrillator. And everyone, if you have multiple pods, you can't have multiple metronomes. It's just, you need one metronome for everybody. And so I think it's pretty good. Maybe if there were more seamless ways to conduct multiple resuscitation pods at the same time, with a nice display in front of the room that showed everybody's score and helped it be more fun and competitive. I guess that would be, to me, the next ask that I would have. But by and large, I'm actually very satisfied with the equipment.
I like the idea of the gamification between the pods, because that competitive spirit and that rivalry, particularly against those B-shift guys, that's a powerful instrument. What do you think, John?
Oh, absolutely. There's nothing like competition to improve competency. It just does. We talked about B-shift earlier. Everybody wants to beat B-shift, but more importantly, everybody just wants to be good, and they want to be better than the next guy. And there's certainly no reason we can't use that to support education, especially in the type of education we're talking about when we're talking about resuscitation technology and resuscitation skills.
Absolutely. We got a couple comments. I'm going to bring it up on stage here from Stephanie. Technology's improved quite a bit since then. Well, actually, I've got this in the reverse order. Pardon me. Let me bring that up. When they first deployed pit crew CPR and crew resource management, we learned quickly that the training pads that went with our monitors required a fairly archaic EKG simulator in order for the CPR dashboard and see-through CPR to show. And she goes on, but the technology has improved quite a bit then. Have you run into any issues with these compatibility issues with the simulators and what you attach to it, John?
Yeah, absolutely. Manufacturer to manufacturer, how old the system is you're using, how new the system is you're using, that can be difficult, and agencies need to be very, very cautious of. I always had the box that had the 10 million different connectors and tails in it, so I could try and manipulate, but that causes a slowdown in the data transfer or the slowdown of the video. So you have to be really careful with that kind of stuff. I'm a firm believer that you can't build good education using old technology and old equipment. You need to update. You need to be out there. I understand everybody can't get an immersion technology room where they can put their people in this immersion environment. But what Tom is doing is an excellent concept and works for him and works for his people. And there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't have to be super high fidelity. You don't need an immersion room if it works for you. You have to use the education and the technology combination that works for your people.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday about these different technologies and levels of complexity and sophistication. You don't have to have the simulation be all things for all tasks. Tom had an anecdote yesterday about using couch cushions. I forget the context though, but I like the couch cushion idea. That's fairly low tech. What was that specifically about, Tom?
It was just, the hardest part in teaching high performance CPR is swapping out the rescue air on chest compressions during the perishock pause. So you pre-charge the monitor, and then someone says stop CPR, that person gets out of the way, the person on airway comes around and goes to hover, and during that time the person on the monitor position has 5 seconds to make up their mind, is there going to be a shock or no shock? And then you start your next 2-minute cycle with a new person on chest compressions. When it's done well, it's very satisfying. It's very satisfying because if you can get the whole room doing that perfect, it really builds their confidence, because they have to learn tactical patience. They have to learn when they're supposed to do which thing. And it's when everything comes together. Because individual ventilation, yes, everyone can do that. Individual chest compressions, everyone can do that. 30 and 2, I'm on compressions, you're on ventilations, and then you switch. Everyone can do that. But when you introduce defibrillation, the wheels come off the wagon and everyone starts getting really stressed out, but then everything starts to click, and then everyone's score shoots up, and it ends on a really high note with everybody really fired up and high fives and high scores on the SimPad. Every single high performance CPR session I've ever been a part of has gone through that exact cycle. And so that portion of swapping out the compressor during the perishock pause, we just simulated it with couch cushions one day because we didn't have the mannequin at Station 6, and it actually worked out all right. I wouldn't say to use that routinely instead of the mannequins, but on that particular day for one particular employee that had missed the training and wanted to understand, it got the job done.
Adapt and overcome.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Educators come up with all kinds of ways to simulate. I mean, earlier in the conference, we were talking about lung compliance and how do I know when I'm bagging that I'm getting adequate compliance. And I can remember early in my career, and please, if there's PETA people, I'm sorry, but early in my career, I remember going to an anatomy lab where they had purchased cow tracheas and lungs that were still operational, connected an endotracheal tube in a bag, and allowed us to observe how lungs expand and how they can be restricted, putting your hands on them, squeezing them down, that sort of thing. And what it felt like when you were squeezing a bag, trying to get past a blockage and that sort of thing. That's a simulation. It doesn't necessarily have to be a $250,000 mannequin. It can be, a $50 purchase from your local slaughterhouse. There's all kinds of ways to do education that include that hands-on approach. And you can tell people 100 times and sometimes they learn, but you just show them, they tend to learn faster and they tend to retain that information.
Yeah, what was occurring to me while Tom was, relating his anecdote is the product opportunity for a torso-shaped couch cushion specifically for EMS and fire stations.
Yep.
All right. So, Brett, you were messaging me about asking a question. You were having a little bit of an issue, so please jump in on stage or type it into the Q&A box, whichever one you want to do. Here she comes.
Good morning. Great discussion, guys. So my question is specifically for John. You talked a lot about in your opening session how you have to customize the learning and the way that the education, the information is delivered. How do you advise people? What do you think is the best practice for learning what works for the majority of people in your agency? Or does it have to be that granular person by person approach?
Well, there's two ways to do it. If you're doing, mass continuing education by shift or by station or however you do it, you have to try and use multiple techniques. You can use the PowerPoint slides, the skills setups, the simulations. But you can also take an opportunity when you have time with employees individually and get them involved in what they're learning. I've had employees come to me and say, hey, I've got reading time. I'm at a slower station. What article should I be reading? What journal should I be reading? What textbook should I be reading? And you give them a list. And if you can provide it for them, that's even better. But I've had others who say, well, I can't do that. I can remember having a medical director when I used to say I didn't like to read. I do now, but I didn't then. And he used to give me, and I'm going to show my age, he used to give me cassette tapes that and was Annals of Emergency Medicine on cassette. And bless Dr. Harvey Rowling for doing that for me. I had a 45-minute drive to work, so I would pop those tapes in and listen on the way and on the way back. And a lot of the understanding I had about the physiology of the way we did business and the way we did our medicine came because I was able to listen to those tapes. That was something I needed. I learned to be able to read and comprehend better, but every employee is different, and you can't expect them all to just jump into a classroom with PowerPoint. You have to, who's not succeeding? If someone's not succeeding, sit down with them, find out why they're not succeeding. Why are they not showing up for CE? Is it because they don't like the PowerPoints? Or is it because they don't understand? There are lots of ways to adapt, especially nowadays between podcasts and videos, and you can still use DVDs and those sorts of things. There's plenty of ways to do that. But the educator, the instructor, the chief of training, whatever you want to be called, has to be willing to take the time to sit with the employee and figure that out. And yes, if you have a department of 250 medics, that's time consuming. But you have field training officers, you have shift training personnel. That needs to be taught to them as well. They need to be able to adapt to that process.
I heard something, you hear it all the time, I just don't know where the study is, that talks about people have to hear things 3 times before they even register it. And so what I think I just heard you say is that you've got to have kind of a multi-pronged approach to education, and not one thing works for everyone.
Exactly.
So kind of a second follow-up question, and thank you for your time, John. Tom, what are your thoughts? I think, education is a pretty, interestingly divisive conversation in EMS. In a lot of ways, whether it should be a bachelor's or an associate's, or and then it quickly becomes about pay scales and requirements and national standards and those things. But how do you teach to the masses, understanding you need to customize and personalize in a way that isn't divisive to those people that don't fall in that category, that don't learn well with PowerPoint, and your only way to deliver that is that PowerPoint? How do you manage that?
Oh, well, if that's all you have is the PowerPoint, I would agree that is a big challenge, making it feel relevant, because most folks, they don't mind getting dirty. They just don't want their time wasted.
Right.
And so what I really liked about John's previous comments, and it made me reflect a little bit, we can talk about individual skills and training, and then you talk about team-based skills and training, and that's also important. But there's a third one, which is organizational learning. Are the guys on A shift on the north end of the island doing it the same way as the guys on C shift on the south end of the island? Because it shouldn't matter. You should be consistent across categories. And so one of the things that we did is we have, let's say you have 10 high-performance CPR instructors, and on any given day, one of those instructors will be in a particular station teaching a particular thing. So we have 7 stations and 3 shifts. So that's 21 different crews, plus headquarters and plus our training station. So that's 22 different sessions that we're doing the same training. You can't have an identical experience across all of those things. So what we started doing is we had our instructors write down every question that was asked with each crew. And then we had a follow-up debriefing, and we made a master list of every single question that was asked by any employee in all 22 sessions. And then we got in a room and we would grind it out. Okay, Trey Daniel wants to know why we're not using the child bag for ventilation. Someone else wants to know at what point we consider double sequential defibrillation. Someone else wants to know, what if you're just about to start a ventilation, but it's time for the perishock pause? They ask a lot of really good questions that sometimes you're like, huh, that's a really interesting.
Right.
By agreeing on what the answers to all those questions are in a team meeting with all the instructors, I know they're teaching it consistently. Now, if any of them are ever asked that question again, they're going to give Hilton Head Island Fire Rescue's answer to that question, not this particular instructor's opinion, and it helps us be consistent from an organizational standpoint. So I really hadn't clarified in my mind until I was listening to John talk, that when we think about the individual and then the team, let's think about the whole organization as well for that total consistency.
That's a great one.
Consistency breeds competency.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing that you're doing is, hearing you talk through that process, is you're also giving a voice to people who aren't maybe so comfortable or confident speaking up in a session. And you're answering questions. I think a lot of times I'm not an EMS educator, but I'm a presenter, and I love education in general. When someone asks a question in one session, in our heads as teachers, we think we answered that. So when 20 sessions later, you assume that everyone got that same information, not because your intentions are poor, but you just, in your head, you checked that box already. So kind of reiterating that information time by time and having that standard to say, this is the new content that we're going to add. Because to me, what I heard is you're identifying gaps in content. There's pieces that weren't delivered and people still had questions. And so you're creating kind of stage by stage a more comprehensive deliverable that better serves your agency and the individuals within that. That's great, Tom. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
So Stephanie mentioned, instructor piloting and debriefing is very important for success and consistency. No, absolutely. The other thing that occurs to me is this all kinds of also fits in with the notion of design thinking. So going back to Tom's anecdote about how they have taken the questions from these other sessions, it influenced the design of the training process. It made it more robust. And this kind of gets also to the essence between quality assurance and quality improvement. Quality assurance would be reinforcing, this is how our pit crew CPR scenario is supposed to go here. This process, boom, 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 boom. But where the process becomes improved and more robust in these small increments, which is huge over time, is what really struck me, Tom, was the comment about just before I'm about to ventilate, we're going to have the pause. And so what happens is, rather than that being an anecdote now, it gets built into the policy. When this happens, this is how the process design is now changed. Even though it's a small change, we have changed the process design.
Yes.
That is now benefiting from the collective experience and the questioning of the operators.
You're absolutely right. And it makes the pods run so much smoother, because the moment they hear the capacitor charging, if you're on airway, you put the bag down, you're done. And so, we're going to end on compressions and we're going to start back up on compressions. So it doesn't matter if you were on 28, 29, and then the capacitor started charging. Nope, that person's just doing continuous compressions until they're told to stop. The airway person's done. Everybody knows that. And so it absolutely made the process better and stronger based on that feedback. That's a really good point.
And it should be clinically informed, because you're going to have to make that decision on the basis of whether or not, what's the trade-off in going ahead and delivering that ventilation or letting it go until the next one. And we know that if we've been doing a good job, we've got good oxygen reserve built up from our high performance CPR. It's probably worse to have that extended pause, and the science bears that out. The pauses are deadly.
Yes, and you're going to increase interthoracic impedance by filling the chest full of air right before a defibrillation attempt, and that's also undesirable. So there's multiple reasons to end on compressions, and start back up on compression. So you're absolutely right. We explain why, and then we tell them what our policy is going to be. And it might be like, to Trey's point, he's like, he wants to use a child bed. It's not a horrible idea. Maybe we will do that one day. but we're not ready to make that change yet, but we hear you. We're thinking about it. Seattle's not doing it yet. We're not doing it yet, but we hear you. But right now we still want you to use the adult bag.
Yeah, and that's fine, because again, going back, I look at things through this, improvement science and quality management lens. Until we decide to change the process, we want people to follow the process, and we want the process design change to be well informed by the evidence, our experience, our resources, et cetera. And what I'm thinking, may happen is when the respiratory monitoring technology becomes more ubiquitous, you may find in a controlled experiment that you might do as an evaluation is put that ventilation sensor in line and look at some actual cardiac arrests and see, how well you were doing with the adult BVM, with the pinking up in the air and all of those technique things versus the child bag. But we'll actually have instrumentation to look at this. All right, so we are just about at 30 minutes after, so we'll go ahead and wrap the session up. Thank you, everybody, for your participation on this. And we're going to go ahead and take a 30-minute break. Take advantage of the lounge. Stop by and say hello to the suppliers in the booth. And when we resume at 1 o'clock, we will be watching a presentation on physiologic monitoring resuscitation with Dr. Ian Drennan. So look forward to seeing that. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.